Hello everybody, welcome to Knowledge 10, Lesson 3, The Shot Heard Round the World. Yes, in this you'll be able to identify some important things, some significant events that led up to the Revolutionary War. Now, there's a word I'd like you to learn, and that's volunteers. You might have an idea of what a volunteer is, but you'll definitely know at the end of this lesson. So listen carefully to find out what happened that led to the shot heard round the world. Now, after the Boston Tea Party, King George of England sent thousands of British soldiers to Boston to make sure that the people living there, the colonists, obeyed the king's orders. They walked all over the streets with their fancy red uniforms, their shiny buttons, and because their clothes were red, they were called redcoats. They carried weapons wherever they went, and that made people who lived in Boston very angry. The city didn't feel like home to them, not with these people marching around like soldiers with guns. They didn't know whom to trust. Spies spread out all over the city. Spies are people who secretly keep watch on other people to try to find out what they're up to. They were disguised as colonists, and colonists disguised as British soldiers. There was lots of whispering in the streets as people kept secrets from one another. It was not at all pleasant, and in fact, it was even a little scary. Paul Revere was a silversmith living in Boston. As a silversmith, he was kept pretty busy making and repairing silver dinnerware, like spoons and candlesticks and jewelry. A sign with a silver pitcher hung upside down that hung outside his shop in the town square was, people looked at that and they said, oh yeah, there's that silversmith Paul Revere. One day, the door to his shop flew open and a friend rushed over to his side. They were both members of the Sons of Liberty, a group of patriots who had emptied tea into Boston's harbor. Ever since that Boston Tea Party, the colonists of Massachusetts were hiding weapons, gunpowder, and cannonballs in neighboring towns. The British, who were afraid that the colonists might be planning to attack them, captured the weapons whenever they learned where they were hidden. Now, as the two men huddled together in the back of Revere's shop, his friend whispered that the British were planning to raid the colonists' storehouse of weapons in the town of Concord. The British were to travel that night, he said, but nobody knew whether they would get there by land or choose the shorter route and sail on a boat by sea. The Patriots knew they must somehow warn the militia in Concord that the British were coming by sea. By the way, a militia is an army of ordinary people, like you and me, and mom and dad. They're not trained soldiers, just people, who get together to defend a town. Revere and others spied on the British. That means they secretly watched over them to discover the soldiers' plans. When Revere learned that the troops were coming by sea, he arranged for a signal to be given, a secret code. His friend was to climb up the bell tower of the Old North Church. Light one lantern and hang it in the belfry if the British are traveling on foot by land, Revere told his friend. But if they are traveling on a boat by sea, hang 2 lanterns. Paul Revere left his family and crept down to the banks of the Charles River. He quietly crossed the river in a boat to a spot where he borrowed a horse from his friend and fellow patriot. Paul Revere got on the horse, tipped his hat thanks to the patriots, and sped away. As he galloped through towns along the way, Revere shouted to the colonists in their beds, "The redcoats are coming! The redcoats are coming!" All around him, shutters were thrown open as people began waking in the middle of the night. When Paul Revere reached the town of Lexington, with word of the approaching British troops, men hurried from their homes, joining with one another and their muskets there in the middle of town. These men, known as Minutemen because they were expected to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, slept with their muskets and gunpowder beside their beds. Revere was joined by a second rider, William Dawes, who had been sent on the same mission but following a different path to Lexington. At dawn, the British reached Lexington. The Minutemen were farmers and shopkeepers, volunteers for their country, not trained soldiers. Now, volunteers are people who choose to do a job without being paid. They looked ragged next to the well-dressed British soldiers or redcoats. In the confusion of the early morning hours, a shot was fired. Others fired back, and fighting continued throughout the morning. Finally, Minutemen were able to force the British to return to Boston, firing at them from behind rocks, trees, and fences all along the way. To this day, no one knows who fired the first shot that day. Nerves had been on edge since the Boston Tea Party, so it's not surprising that guns went off. Now, that first shot was the beginning of a long war between the British and their American colonies. It is known as the shot heard round the world because not only did it change life in the colonies, but it also changed things around the world in Great Britain all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, that long war became known as the Revolutionary War. Could it be that the shot heard round the world rang out so loudly from the Massachusetts colony that it actually reached King George's ears that April morning? What do you think? All right, the shot heard round the world. Well, what was the main topic of that read aloud? Yes, if you're thinking that the main topic is that the Revolutionary War started with the battle at Lexington and that Paul Revere helped the Minutemen prepare to fight the British, you're right. And who were the Redcoats? If you're thinking the British Army, you're right. And the Minutemen? They were the colonial militia, right? Now, in that read aloud, we heard, the Minutemen were farmers and shopkeepers, volunteers for their country, not trained soldiers. Say that word, volunteers. Volunteers are people who do something without being paid to do something. Like, there are lots of volunteers at the fire station. Have I ever asked for a volunteer in the classroom? Can you think of other places where volunteers might help out? Like a volunteer ambulance squad that you might have? You might volunteer to take the garbage out in your house. That means you're going to do it. You don't expect somebody to give you a piece of pie afterward. So, anyway, here's a situation like if two people offer to pick up litter on the playground, they're volunteering to do it, right? Or if two people said that, they'll take the neighbor's dog for a walk. We'll volunteer to do that because our neighbor is sick and she needs help, right? Okay, that's that. The next story we hear is going to be Lesson 4, and if I can turn to that quickly enough, I'll find out what it is. It's declaring independence. That is, when this country that we live in became a country. So stay listening and learning.